Good evening, everybody. This is Ed Yohnka. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Policy here at the ACLU of Illinois. I want to welcome you to this program tonight, We the People, a discussion on democracy. I want to welcome you all for joining us. I'm going to just sort of vamp here for just a moment as we have some other folks joining us and give them a chance to get online before we begin. But again, I want to thank you for taking your time, and we're going to be respectful and mindful of your time and get you out of here tonight in 1 hour. So with that, let me dive in and begin and just give you a couple of housekeeping matters as we're starting tonight. First of all, there are live captions for tonight's event. If you need to turn them on, just click the arrow next to closed caption at the bottom of your screen and choose show subtitles. You'll also see that we have ASL interpreters with us tonight, and we thank them for being here and for joining us as well. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so you can see that there is a Q&A box in which you can ask a question. Please feel free to put that in here, and folks will help me in terms of getting to as many of those questions as we possibly can, and give a chance. You can also participate in the chat that's ongoing at the same time. The late Attorney General and presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy once observed that democracy is messy and it's hard. And he said that it's never easy. Well, that may be more true today than it ever has been at any time during our lives. About a year ago, the ACLU set out on a project across Illinois to talk to our members and potential members and some folks who had been members and let their memberships lapse. And one of the things that we repeatedly heard from them was how important and how concerned they were at that time about the future of democracy in America. It was, of course, in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and folks were just concerned about that and the follow-up to the 2020 election in terms of voter suppression measures that were being taken across the country. I think it's fair to say that in the year since we heard that from our membership, that concerns that people have simply risen. You have a number of additional voter suppression measures being put into place and promises of more after this election cycle. You have efforts on the part of some election deniers to actually get in and be able to be in position to operate, control the outcome of, and oversee our election process. And I think maybe most sad of all for me is that we see an increasing number of people in political polls who are willing to say that violence is an appropriate tool to use in political dialogue and in political discussions and in efforts to advance public policy. And so we really need to talk about democracy. And we really need to think about the role that each of us plays in assuring that our democracy continues. Again, as Kennedy said, it's always messy and it's always hard and it's never easy, but it's not going to be preserved unless each of us is willing to do the work. This discussion tonight is the culmination of a series of programs that we've been doing in conjunction with the Weinstein Art Gallery in Chicago. And we want to thank them for their partnership, the Weinstein Newton Gallery, I should say, David, in case Jerry's listening. And we want to thank them for their help in all of this. But I really do want to start this by welcoming David Weinberg to join us and to give a welcome and an overview from his perspective about this discussion.
Thank you, Ed, and a warm welcome from the Weinberg Newton Gallery. and from our partners, the ACLU. We are so happy that you're joining us tonight for the panel discussion. We know it's going to be worthwhile. So just a word about the ACLU. This is the third time that we have partnered with the ACLU. And for those of you who have heard that the ACLU is a bunch of dedicated people, dedicated to civil liberties, that they're hardworking and genuinely care for all people, I want you to know that every one of those descriptors is true. They are just a group of incredible people. I've always been happy they're with us in this world, but more so today than ever. So again, another successful partnership. So I'll tell you just a little about the Weinberg Newton Gallery because I think some of you may not have visited. We're located at 688 North Milwaukee Avenue in what they call River West. We are a non-commercial gallery. We are not selling anything. Instead, we're devoted to social justice. Our mission is to promote discussion about social justice issues. And we do that by partnering with social justice not-for-profits and showcasing the work that they do through exhibits and through programs. And so tonight is a program that's part of an exhibit called All That Glows in the Dark of Democracy. And it was curated beautifully by Kasia Houlihan. And we thank her so much for that. The exhibit challenges us to think about our own definition of democracy. And it's done through 6 artists that provide light, sound, touch, and sight as clues to our own interpretation of democracy. Only when we know what we expect from democracy can we determine whether it is succeeding or not. So the exhibit runs until October 1st. You can certainly still come in and view it firsthand, or you can see it on our website at weinbergnewtongallery.com. We determined it is, but we have determined that democracy is working, but it's not working for everybody in this country. We also believe that democracy is in critical danger from those who do not have the patience or the respect for the rule of law. So originally we had another exhibit that was going to occupy this time slot. And with the advent of election deniers and all that happened on January 6th, we decided we had a sense of urgency and we had to cover democracy post haste. So we put democracy into that time slot. And who better to partner with but the ACLU, who are the guardians of our freedoms and civil rights. So just one word, and that is that we hope you are inspired by tonight's discussion and move to take action on your own, get involved in the issues that will be discussed tonight. So our final exhibit and programming focuses on youth and incarceration, and it starts on October 14th. And we hope that you will come and visit us for that exhibit and programming. And we hope that you'll sign up for our mail-in list by going to our website. So enjoy the evening, learn from it. We're so happy to have everybody with us. Ed, back to you.
Thank you so much, David. I'm going to bring in our panelists in just a moment, but before I do, I'm going to put you all to work for just a moment. We have a poll question that we'd like to do just to sort of set the tone for the evening. And the question is, how much does the commonly heard sentiment of American democracy being in crisis resonate with you at this moment? You can take your time to think about it and answer that question. And with that, I'm going to introduce our three panelists for this evening. We're pleased to be joined this evening by, first of all, Ken Page, who is a local activist and the president of the ACLU chapter in the state's capital of Springfield, Illinois. We're also joined by Aram Han Sifuentes, who is one of the artists in the exhibit. And Aram has been good enough to join us tonight. We're really looking forward to her perspective on this as part of this discussion. And then last but not least, Colleen Connell, who is the executive director of the ACLU of Illinois, is here with us. So panelists, first of all, welcome and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Ed, for moderating.
So I'm going to jump in here, and Ken, I'm going to start with you and just get a little level set here for folks and see what people are thinking or see what you all are thinking. And I want to just start with you and ask you, what is your definition of democracy?
Well, I know it's not this utopia and what we would like for it to be. I growing up in the Deep South, I know it's a representation elected by the people and for the people and doing the good of the people. Now, that's the way I feel, that's my definition of democracy. I know there's a textbook definition, but that's the way I look at democracy.
Right, right. Aram, how about you?
Yeah, like Ken said, I think it's about, us having a say in our own governance, right? Whether that's representation or the laws that we have to abide by that protect us. And
Colleen, you must have a legal definition.
Well, I'm going to sound like some lawyer who's worked for the ACLU for 2/3 of her life, and I would build on what Ken and Aram said, which is basically, people have a voice in the sort of big decisions of civic engagement. Who got the most votes in an election, who won the election, but a structure that provides protection for individual liberties and individual rights that are fundamentally individual in nature. What faith you choose to embrace, who you choose to marry, what you care to, who you care to associate with. Those are the kind of individual liberties that have to be protected by the structure. It shouldn't be open to majority rule as to, like I said, religious belief, what you say, who you associate with, who you marry.
So you have both the majority for big decisions, but also it protects the individual rights to sort of be your whole self.
Correct.
So listen, one of the great things about doing this on Zoom is we have this little chat feature. So, one of the things, if you're watching this and you have a different definition or there's something that you think ought to be included, feel free to type that in as we keep talking. Aram, I want to sort of start with you on this round. And how do you think the reality of what democracy looks like today aligns with the definition that you described just a couple of moments ago?
Right. I think that's a really great question. And, I think the ideas or how popular dominant culture talks about democracy is that we all have this voice, we all have a say. And, the most tangible way of kind of seeing that is voting, which obviously is really important. But, as you can see in my work, the official and unofficial voting station, voting for all who legally can't, shows that more than 1/4 of the population can't legally vote for all sorts of reasons, right? And so for me, the reality of democracy is that it's an abstract concept and that it's not real for everybody.
So Colleen, let's turn to you next. When you think about that definition that you gave, how is the reality different from at least today, and how it's working from that definition?
I think Aram has really hit the nail on the head, that many in our democracy don't have the right to vote and don't have protected participation rights. And I think dangerous thing about that, going back to the large number of our listeners tonight who really believe that our democracy is under threat, is that a large part of the reason that people cannot participate is because one political party in this country, the GOP, has really adopted, I think, an agenda of discrediting elections that they don't win. And I'm going to cite both the congressman from Illinois, Adam Kinzinger, and the congresswoman from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, for this proposition, because the ACLU is nonpartisan, but I think it's really important to be candid with each other in identifying the problem. And I think that the other and related problem is that people have begun to really try to rewrite what the framers really meant to protect in the Bill of Rights, under the guise of an original interpretation of the Constitution that really plays fast and loose with history. And I'll give one prime example of this. The theme on the part of the religious right that that the United States was founded as a Christian country is just plain false. It's a lie, and nothing could be further than the truth. I mean, the framers of the Constitution, inserted the First Amendment's protection for religious liberty because they were the direct descendants of people who had fled Europe because of religious strife, and they did not want that kind of strife tearing this new country apart.
So, Ken, I think you started to hint a little bit, even in your definition, at how you see that definition falling short. But I wonder if you want to pick up on the themes that Aram and Colleen have talked about.
Oh, yes, definitely. And those were important points that both Aram and Colleen made. But I would like to add on to this is that I'm going to talk about the individual. Because when we go into that booth to vote, it's like an individual thing. And so many people are disenchanted that democracy has been hijacked. And it's the superpowers at the top are the ones that are defining democracy for us and what is good for us and all of those things that they would like to see for us. But when you look at it in reality, it's the people with their feet on the ground, the people that were in those booths that were voting, that have been disenfranchised, voter suppression, poverty. We look at gun violence and all those things and drugs in America and all those things that have impacted those people that we encourage to go out to vote for democracy and say that you will make the difference if you go out and do that. And they come back and they said and they see how the powers to be that think that they are, and maybe they are, have changed it so that they make those decisions. And you're never given an opportunity to even discuss those decisions with them. We don't even have the true town hall meetings where that information is taken back in a true form, to say that the people have discussed this with me and this is what we should do. And which is unfortunate because then you have so many people that do not want to vote again because, and there's a song that I think the Staples Singers made. It was a thing in there that they were lying, the politicians were lying to the racists. And that's a common thread to this day, that people feel that they're just lying to us as a race of people in order to get us to vote for them. So, and which is unfortunate, and all those things, people feel that they've been hoodwinked and to vote for someone. And once they get in, they change on them and all of the above.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I just wanted to read a couple of these chats that we've gotten about definitions of democracy. One person said that in a democracy, we're protected when we criticize the government. And someone else said, I define democracy as people being represented by someone who will put their interests first and the majority deciding how our country should be run and what laws should be passed, which is interesting given your observation, Ken. I wonder if, I wonder, Colleen, if I could start with you on this round, and I almost wonder if we shouldn't even have waited to held this question till the end, but I can't resist. Okay, I'm giving you each a magic wand to wave around and fix democracy in whatever way. What is the one or the first thing that you would do or want to fix in order to address democracy in America?
Well, you'd mute me if I said what I was really thinking. So I'm going to pick out a big structural flaw. If I could wave my wand, I would eliminate the Electoral College, and I would also likely tinker with the structure of Congress. You know, where, for example, the state of California has 2 senators representing, you know, the tens of millions of people who live in California. My home state of North Dakota has the same number of senators, 2, representing 700,000 people, and that has created, you know, I think an imbalance, to state the obvious, in our representational system, where Congress really does not reflect a representative body that is truly proportionally representative of the population of the United States. It favors small states like North Dakota, Wyoming, small in terms of population. And so I think that those interlocking structural problems, which are very difficult to change because of the challenges of amending the Constitution,
Yeah.
would be the starting place for my magic wand.
You know, I think the data I've seen recently is it takes 78 voters in California to get the same representation that 1 voter gets in Wyoming in the United States Senate. And that really speaks to that structural piece you're talking about. Okay, we've lost Aram for a moment, but Ken, hey, you're up. You got the magic wand. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to say it's dangerous to give me a magic wand because there are a lot of things I would do with it. But I would like, in addition, Colleen brought up an important point, and that's in my discussion down the line, was the Electoral College. And I agree with President Obama. It's a relic, and we know where relics are, you know, where they're put on shelves and things like that. And it's a dinosaur, and we know what happened to the dinosaurs. But what I would really fix is the Supreme Court of the United States. And I know that's not saying what I would do to it.
Okay.
But I know Ed wants to know, well, how would you fix that?
Yes.
Do you want me to answer that? I think that the numbers should be increased.
Okay.
In the favor of democracy.
Okay. Aram is back with us, and Aram, you missed the question, but I'm giving you a magic wand to fix democracy. What is the first thing you wave the wand at?
I think it would be it would be about enfranchisement, right? Truly letting everyone vote and having the legal right to.
Great. So let me move on here for a second. President Biden gave a major speech recently in which he suggested that each of us really has a duty to protect and affirm and advance democracy. And, you know, although there's a partisan divide that I think Colleen talked about earlier, American voters who identify as independents or Democrats have suggested in polling recently that the protection of democracy is among their top issues in the upcoming midterm elections. And I think there's a widespread kind of undeniable sense that really our experiment in democracy in this country is at risk. And so I wonder, against that backdrop, you know, what you see as the major signs of stress. We've talked about some of them, but I think just to think about, you know, where you see the real stressors coming right now. And Colleen, I see you're off mute, so why don't I just go ahead and start with you?
So it's going to be themes that have already resonated. I think it's been the asymmetrical radicalization of the Republican Party, which really gets reflected in not honoring election results if they didn't win. And, I think that we've also seen a lack of serious intent to govern by the GOP. And really reducing, so much of it to, just basically partisan, trophy hunting, really, in many respects. And, to pick up on the Supreme Court theme, I think that one of the consequences of this asymmetrical polarization has been the deliberate selection of judges for their ideology, including their commitment to a constitution that no longer reads, exactly how it was written because of the amendment process, and was never intended to really lock in place the conditions at the time of ratification of 1787. And yet we have a Supreme Court in which, the most recent of which, 3 judges appointed, really have been put on by their ideology. And I think the fact that, so many of our current justices have been nominated by a president who did not win the majority of votes, as opposed to the Electoral College, underscores how the Electoral College, the disproportionate representation, really skew our democratic system in ways that are much broader than just who is seated in Congress or who is the temporary resident of the White House. And I think that those tensions and have really created a crisis of legitimacy for both Congress and the Supreme Court. I think that the poll results that were released recently that show for the first time in a long time that the Supreme Court is not really considered legitimate by a very significant number of voters is troubling for this country. I don't disagree with where those voters are coming out. I think the court's decisions, particularly this term, really show it to be an unprincipled and I think in some ways disingenuous arbiter of constitutional rights. Explains a lot of that public concern. But I think, stepping away from the term, we have a serious problem in this country when a significant number of people really question the legitimacy of our governmental branches.
So I want to skip here to Aram. I know we lost you for a moment, and just making sure that we don't again. I wonder, can you talk a little bit about the installation that you created as part? You mentioned it actually before as part of the exhibit at the gallery, and a little bit of how you conceptualized that and imagined it.
Yeah, sorry. Of course, the cafe I'm at lost internet. So the project I started, official and unofficial voting station, voting for all who legally can't. I started that in 2016, and that was because I wasn't a citizen at the time, and so I couldn't legally vote. But as we remember during that election, so much that was at stake was immigration policy, and it was just like, I really wanted to have a say in what would so greatly impact my safety, right? The safety of my family, my community, my friends, of course. And so I just kept thinking about, wow, like so much that's at stake, we have no say, right? As non-citizens. And then I started really asking that question, who can't legally vote in the United States? And I was first a bit surprised to find that it was it was a bit hard to find that answer, and especially to find how large that population is. And so I just kept doing research, and I continue to do research, and I'm constantly surprised at what I find. And even to a point where Loyola University, I think last academic year, gave me, the Center for Urban Research and Learning gave me my own research team to really look into this question. And so, so I knew I wanted to create voting stations through art for those who can't legally vote. And then finding how big this population is, right? So like, of course, youth under 18, non-citizens, and then depending on your state, incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, again, depending on your state, those who are deemed mentally incapacitated, right? Depending on your state ID laws in terms of voting, if you don't have those access to those, IDs, and then of course for presidential candidate, the U.S. territories, right? And so knowing how big that population is, I knew I didn't want to just create one voting station. So I wanted to create as many as possible. So in 2016, I worked with the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, and we connected with more than 15 artists, activists, organizations all over the US and Mexico. And we created over 25 different voting stations then. And so I did this project again in 2020 and worked with over like 50 artists and organizations and student groups, and created more than 50 voting stations then. And then here for 2022, working with the Weinberg Newton Gallery and doing my installation there that is really kind of kitschy, glow in the dark aesthetics, right? Thinking about, how we're kind of in the dark, but we're glowing in the dark, right? And really creating a fun environment, right? So like, if I can reimagine voting, I want it to be a disco dance scene, right? And so that's kind of where the inspiration came from. And then for this one, since it isn't about, candidates in particular, or at least like presidential candidates, which the previous two kind of focused a bit more about, I really wanted to ask the question of, what do we wish we could vote on? And so that is what this installation is asking.
And I just want to say, if in the chat, there's a link to Ram's installation, you can actually participate in this, which is a really great thing. And it was really fun to do because it does challenge you to think about all of the issues, we'd like to vote on and what that would look like. I will admit, I didn't think of it being a disco to go and vote in. Maybe I should just broaden my horizons. One of the things that's interesting, because I think this is a kind of thing we never get to talk about at the ACLU, but I wonder what you think of as the kind of the intersection between art and democracy, and art and human rights. Where do you see those intersections?
Yeah, I mean, so many, right? And there's so many different intersections. And, having made this type of political art for many years, I realize, how important art is in many ways to talk about political issues, talk about democracy. And some of those, particularly with this project, I think number one thing that it really does is it shares information, right? I there's so many times where people come and they're like, wow, I really didn't know how large this group is that can't legally vote, right? Or I didn't know that these were the categories. And so it becomes a way to share that information, right? And also on the other side, there's a lot of people that, I won't say a lot, but there's a handful of, instances where people who could legally vote and didn't know it enter the gallery, and through seeing the information realize, oh, I can legally vote. I'm going to register to vote, right? And so there's some of that aspect with this installation as well. But I think really at the core of it is, two things, right? For someone who spent most of my life being disenfranchised, it's a symbolic gesture, but I'm always surprised how emotional I see some people get. Right. And I'm like, this is an art project, and it's not, It's not, it's symbolic, right, to be able to vote, but it's really a powerful gesture that we get to participate and experience, right? And then another part of it is, in the same vein, I'm using art to create what I wish was possible, right? And the hope in doing that is that then we get to experience what voting for all, right? Without these legal barriers of disenfranchisement can be. And then hopefully with us experiencing it, we can then make it come to fruition and really fight for it.
So, Aram, we're going to put your fellow panelists on the spot here. We aren't going to get to go into the voting booth, but we're going to ask both Colleen and Ken, what issues, when you think about it, what issues would you want to vote on? Ken, I'm going to go to you first.
I would look at, that's a difficult one. I'm not exactly sure how it would appear on the ballot, but reproductive rights, abortion rights. I think that voting rights, do we need an ID to vote? I think Aram hit on a lot of things, especially with people who's eligible to vote and also people not knowing that they are eligible to vote.
Yeah.
There's so many people that have been disenfranchised, with the system, the pre-trial, and even after you leave the system, you have a right to vote. And there's so many people will say, I don't think I can vote because, I was locked up.
Right.
And that narrative has been put out there for a reason. And but I would like to see those things on the ballot. And I think you would be surprised how people will vote for them and how people will feel or truly feel about it in this country.
Colleen, what about you?
So everything that Ken said, plus I'd like to think about like a nationwide referendum on immigration. We know that people, we are in many respects, with the exception of our indigenous people, we are all immigrants, and I think people should vote on immigration. And when I say that, I think you cannot draft statutes by vote, but I think some referenda in which you basically get a sense of where the majority is on the issues Ken said on immigration. I would add universal health care in there. I would add some economic rights in there, because I think that these are issues that really touch people everyday lives, and are the kinds of things oftentimes that should be decided by majority rule, or at least a sense of the majority, rather than a not very representative government.
Yeah. So, Colleen, I wonder, I'm going to sort of pivoting back to our conversation before, I wonder if you could talk about, what is the link between democracy and civil liberties? How do you see those two issues linked up? Why do we care as a civil liberties organization about democracy and the way that it functions?
I think that without a democracy, you don't have any meaningful protection of civil liberties or civil rights. Even when we look at a country like Great Britain, it really is a constitutional monarchy with some very fundamental rights embedded in that country's history and statute, going back to the Magna Carta in 1215. And
we always have to throw in the Magna Carta.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter what the discussion is. We have to talk about the Magna Carta.
We do. But I mean, and so you've got to have a democratic structure of some sort in order to have meaningful protections of civil rights or civil liberties. And you can, really pick out any of the authoritarian regimes in history, and no civil liberty is safe. I mean, even though people didn't necessarily define rights as civil liberties or civil rights, 300 years ago, it wasn't safe. If you angered the ruling elite, your property rights, your family, your life, is at issue or is at
Right.
risk.
Right. Hey, Ken, you sort of talked about this earlier, but I wanted to come back to something I've been thinking about that you talked about, which is, people engaging or not engaging. And I wonder about, when you think about it, you live in Springfield, you live in a community where you can reach elected officials pretty easy. You can engage on the matters of concern to your neighbors and yourself and et cetera. So how do you keep people engaged in that sense and in that way, and not let people get that feeling that it just doesn't matter and they kind of give up and walk away? I think you're still on mute.
I do apologize. I should just unmute myself permanently. That's an interesting question. That's very challenging, because you have to meet people where they are and not where you think that they are. Every issue that a politician discusses may not be the issue that the person or that community is interested in. So you look at where people are in their own community and what the needs are in their community, and allow them to voice what their needs are. And then you can present those needs for them, because a lot of people are looking for someone to have that voice for them, that will speak for them. And and if you do that, I think that people will continue to be engaged. And I found that, when the Supreme Court had that whole abolished abortion, basically, I was surprised how people in communities started to discuss that. And I never thought it would be an issue in certain communities, and in the Black male community. I didn't think that it would be an issue, but it is an issue, and they're concerned about that. And I think that if you allow people to discuss what they need and what they want, instead of somebody else telling them this is what we think that you need, then you will be better able to work with different communities, because they will trust you. And if you do that for them, then I think that keeps people engaged, because oftentimes it's those grassroots things that people deal with every day that they want to address.
So Ken, you used an expression, just as a follow-up, you used an expression, meeting people where they are. And I think sometimes we say that. I wonder if you have a good example of a time when you've done that, or how that works for you. Because I think sometimes people hear that and they just need a little something to sort of hold on to with that.
Well, a classic example. Well, I'll tell you a classic example of where we did not meet people where they were. When I was working at EPA, Environmental Justice Office, we thought we were really great. We knew all of the regulations and the statutes and everything. We put everything together, and we went to communities, environmental justice communities, and we told them, this is what we think is good for you. And it never worked for us. And we found out that we never listened to the community. We thought we had all the answers. And sometimes you listen to people in your church. They'll bring up things to you after church is over. They'll say, man, this is something we're dealing with. You have a lot of parents. Once they find out that there's a person with a voice, the ACLU in Springfield, they'll call and say, I'm having this issue with my child at school, or I'm having an issue with the school allowing me to be part of my child's education. There are different things. And so you're meeting those people where they are. So, but, and that's what you listen to, because if you should always listen to what the people say. And I grew up knowing that people were denied the opportunity for people to listen to them.
That's really helpful. I think we talked a little bit about the Supreme Court, and you guys talked about issues at the court. And one of the things that I think is there's a sense, and it goes to what you were just talking about, Ken, is that there's a lot of frustration with the way democracy is working, in the sense that it's a little bit out of touch, and that our voices, don't actually get heard, right? That we're not really part of the discussion. And I wonder if you all have a sense, I'd really love to hear from all of you, and Aram, I might start with you on this one, is what do you think are the best tools to ensure that public institutions and elected officials actually do listen to us? What's your best tip to folks to sort of keep them engaged in that way?
Ooh, that's a big question. I don't know if I have the answer for that, but I think maybe some of the answers are present in my art practice, right? Which is organize, come together, fight in all ways possible, right? And whether that's protests, whether that's through, I'm a part of a Korean traditional all women's drumming group, and we fight for social justice, right? So like whether it's drumming together or protesting or creating banners together and organizing. And I think because, like Ken was saying, it happens grassroots, right? And then it gets bigger and bigger, or multiple grassroots organization, we create coalitions and fight together. And that really, needs to happen, right? And so like a good example of this, right, is that immigrant justice is really important to me. I work with Hana Center a lot at NACASEC, and we're constantly fighting for citizenship for all 11 million undocumented people, right? Which is something that Biden, and particularly Biden, right, promised that he would pass legislation in the first 100 days, which hasn't happened even now, right? And so, and we just need to fight. We have to keep fighting together and not give up, right? And be relentless and keep it going in on as many fronts as possible, whether that's political, whether that's through arts, in every way, right?
And pull every lever, as it were. Colleen, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to my theme of there are more of us than there are of them, and relate that to some advocacy the ACLU has been engaging in recently, and that deals with the efforts to ban books, particularly books that talk about racial justice, books that talk about LGBT rights, books that talk about sex education. And it's often a few people who have been, I think, radicalized by false information and fear. And the most effective way of responding to that is, first of all, as both Ken and Aram said, organize. That isn't a big, scary term. It means reaching out to people, your neighbors, your friends, your family members, and having the courage to say, you know what, there are more of us, and this is really wrong. I'm going to defend the right of my children to read, or the right of my children to learn. And then to speak up about that, because there's a sort of a tactic that those who would ban books want to use. They want to scare everybody into submission and say, if we show up and make a lot of noise and threaten people will be too afraid to come out and really talk about the importance of the truth. And so it's really organizing, and it's really speaking up. I think to probably paraphrase the quote of Hannah Arendt, the only thing that we need for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And I think that it is absolutely essential to humanity and our continued survival that we respect each other's individual rights, and that we not allow ourselves to be bullied by fear into ostracizing immigrants, ostracizing members of the LGBTQ community, ostracizing people with disabilities, ostracizing women who've exercised their reproductive rights. And the only way we're going to really prevail is to continue to reach out and to continue to speak that kind of truth, and to really let those members of our elected offices know that there are more of us and that we need them to stand with us or we will hold them accountable.
And I want
Back to voting.
Yeah, I want to turn to you. There's a question that we got, and I wonder how you would answer it. Anybody can jump in on this, but it says, how do I respond to someone who's age 15 to 18 who looks around at the way the world is today and says, I'll never vote. I don't want anything to do with it. What do you do with that? That kind of, sort of feeling of resignation?
Well, it would be good to get a 15 to 18-year-old to answer that question, and give them an answer. Because oftentimes, you're going to find someone like me to talk to a 15 or 18-year-old. I think there's a reception barrier there. And you have to give them real life examples of things that have changed in this country. Because I know that, people, and Aram mentioned that the voting and the organizing and how people voted, organized and everything behind Senator Obama then. And how there were young people that came out and how young people, and that's important for them to know that. It would be good to get young people to discuss it with young people. And Aram is probably closer to their age than I am. And so that barrier would not be there. It's like, oh, my parent is talking again. I think those examples and showing that they could make a huge difference and giving them an opportunity to say, this is how you can make a difference. Give them an opportunity to organize protests and give them an opportunity. When I was in school, that I wasn't old enough to walk out of school and march in summer, but my older siblings were. Give them an opportunity to do that. And if things are not going right in that school, give them an opportunity to say that you have a right to protest this with your principal as well as your school board, and so forth and so on. If you don't like what your city council is doing, we're gonna give you an opportunity to go there and share that with your city council and things like that. So you got to give those kids an opportunity to have their voices heard, and they should hear from someone closer to their age. And I always felt that way, but.
So, Colleen, I'm gonna start with you, and we're headed to the close here, and I want to thank you for sticking with us through this hour in this discussion. But Colleen, I want to start, I guess, with the final questions. Forgive me, of I guess twofold. Number one, do you think that these problems are repairable, and what gives you hope? You're on mute.
What gives me, I'm going to start with the last one. I'll say no, these problems are not irreparable, but we need to take them seriously. And what gives me hope is events like tonight. And I want to start by thanking our host, David Weinberg, and his wife, Jerry Newton, for partnering with us and allowing us to really be inspired by the art that they make so accessible to really highlight these important themes. And I'm going to say that the kind of action we're seeing tonight of, people coming out, participating, is really, I think, the starting point for hope. Action breeds hope. Not hope breeds action. And I think the more acting out or activism that we all engage in, the more results we will see and the more hopeful we will all be. And the final thing I'm going to say is that in so many ways, whether we look at it through one of the ACLU's favorite quotes of eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, or we look at our work as a marathon, not a sprint, it really underscores that we always have to be involved and be engaged. Voting isn't something we just do once. It's something that we really have a civic obligation to do each and every election, because if we don't vote, we really lose our stake in our democracy.
Aram, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I think being around badasses like you guys, pardon my language, and really finding your community, like I said, finding these communities where we fight together, just it gives me so much hope and gives me energy to keep going. And like Colleen said, I'm actually right now in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, Mexico, right? And so this is where the Zapatista movement happened. And one thing I saw that I see around here is the motif of a snail. And then it says lento pero advanzo. So it's like it's slow, but we advance. And it's a little snail with a Zapatista head. And so I really love that slogan or message, right? That it's slow, but we will advance. Yeah, and we are advancing.
Ken, what about you? What gives you hope?
People and things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years with people, grassroots people, and organizing, and I just look at President Biden, his election. How it came down to women. Women are extremely important in this world, and how it came down to women and that vote, and how in Selma, Alabama, when Judge Moore was running for Senate, U.S. Senate, and Roy Jones, how Black women organized. And I have this graphic, how Black women in Selma, Alabama organized. It was grassroots women that organized to put, Doug Jones in the U.S. Senate. And that was extremely important. It came down to one county, Dallas County, and they waited on that vote. And so they said, well, we're going to see what this vote is. And that's what Selma was. And it was all those women, including my sisters, that were out there every day. And I brought this is one of my prized possessions that I brought back, because I saw this on a building, and I said, I want to have that sign. And this sign, if you can see it, and it said, vote or die. And they wanted people to know that their lives, everything that they were voting for depended on it. And it went back for decades for them getting the vote, and how people died for them to have the vote, and how John Lewis was beaten on the bridge, Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, how that was important to vote. And that still gives me hope, because how people turned out for President Biden, and to make him president. And those were grassroots people. Those were not people that were the higher echelon. Those everyday people that came out and made sure they voted for him. And I think that, and I know that that's still hope in America, because I've seen the mass protests regarding abortion rights and everything. So there's still hope. And voting rights, there's still hope. And I'm probably sounding like Bill Clinton from Hope, Arkansas, but there's still hope. And I have hope, and I do know that there's hope in a lot of people. It's just, you just have to you have to sit down with people and find the good in them, and not look at the differences that we do have.
So I just, as we close, and first of all, I want to thank the panelists. I also just want to comment, sort of picking up on this theme, two things in the last couple of questions. The first is, if you want hope, look at the pictures of the students who walked out of school in Virginia yesterday to protest new discrimination against transgender students. That is something that gives me hope. And one of the other things that gives me hope is from the chat, Ray, who says, I'm an 18-year-old, I just turned 18 this year, and our vote, our voice is important, and we will inherit the world. That is why it is important for us to vote, so that we create the world we want to live in. And that should give us all hope as we close tonight. I want to thank you all for being with us for the past hour. I want to remind you of a couple of things. First of all, the exhibit at the Weinberg Newton Gallery is open until October 1st. I would encourage you to attend and to make sure that you get a chance to see this and see the disco room. You get to vote in that Aram has created for us. I want to remind you all, if you are in Illinois, that today is the first day to ask for a ballot to vote, and the voting process has begun. You should check your voter registration. Remember, you can register all the way up till Election Day in Illinois. You can register and vote even if You were convicted previously of a felony and have been released. You can vote if you are even under a charge but are awaiting trial. Those are things that we are able to do in Illinois, and I would encourage you all to do that. I want to thank everybody who participated. I really especially want to thank our philanthropy and engagement team, and especially Emily Scott and Kayla Flanagan and Luis Gomez for their work in putting this together. They did all the work on this. We just showed up and talked for an hour, which, as you can tell, some of us are really good at. And some of us are even better. And please, please, please get that link and vote in Aram's installation online. You can still do that. Thank you all. We'll be with you soon. And take care and have a great night.